I was never a man of many words, not even when I commanded battalions or stood at the head of briefing rooms filled with officers waiting for my orders. But there's a kind of silence that doesn't come from discipline, only from disappointment, the kind that grows heavier each time you realize your presence is not only unwanted, but an active source of shame. The message from my sons came while I sat in the kitchen, morning light spilling over a table that hadn't known true family warmth in years. My hands were wrapped around a chipped mug, the coffee already cold, when the phone buzzed. No good morning. No, Dad, we hope you're well. Just 4 lines, blunt as a knife. Don't show up today. We talked about it. It's better if you stay home. A failed old man just makes things awkward. There was no signature. There never is when people want to cut you out clean. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. It wasn't anger that came first, nor even the ache of humiliation, but a strange sense of clarity. I thought of all the years I'd stood between chaos and order, of the men who trusted me with their lives, the nights spent awake so my soldiers could sleep. And here, in the quiet of my own home, the sons I'd tried to raise into men believed I was nothing but an embarrassment, someone to be hidden away, out of sight, so their friends and spouses, and whatever remnant of family remained, could celebrate unburdened. I let the phone rest on the table. My hands didn't tremble. Discipline runs too deep for that now. Instead, I looked out the window, watching the wind move through the old maple in the yard, its branches as scarred and unyielding as I felt inside. If they thought I was defeated, it was only because they never cared to see what strength survives beneath the ruins. The words in their message echoed, but what hurt most was how little surprise I felt. Over the years, they'd made it clear in 1,000 small ways skipped birthdays, hollow apologies, forced smiles at holidays, where I was always seated at the edge of the table. Still, something about reading it, so plain and cold, left a mark that no battle ever had. I sat there a long time, letting the silence settle, before I finally stood up and walked toward the room where I kept my past carefully folded away, waiting for a day like this. There are silences that creep in like fog, slow and inevitable, covering over the details of a life until even you begin to question if any of it was ever real. After reading that message, I found myself wandering through the rooms of my house, the walls lined with the detritus of decades, photographs that seemed to yellow a little more each year. My footsteps echoed on the floorboards, carrying the weight of memories my sons had long chosen to forget. They had grown up with stories of distant lands and uniformed men, medals quietly locked away in a desk drawer. But somewhere along the way, those stories became just background noise to them, something mildly embarrassing in the face of their newer, flashier lives. I had watched it happen over time, the way their eyes glazed at the mention of service, how they changed the subject when old friends visited and asked about my years away, the discomfort in their voices if I let slip a reference to command or discipline at the dinner table. With each passing holiday, my seat seemed to move farther from the center, until I was pressed against the wall or left to carve slices of turkey in solitude. There were photographs of birthday parties, or I appeared only as a hand or a shoulder, never in full, never at the heart of things. At first, I thought it was simply the way life moved children grow, create their own stories, outpace the slower rhythm of old men. But it wasn't just time. It was erasure. They began to rewrite the family story in subtle ways, omitting the years of absence that had meant months without sleep, weeks without letters, because I was somewhere on the other side of the world keeping chaos at bay. They didn't want those memories, didn't need them, not when they had newer tales to tell, ones that fit more comfortably in modern living rooms and at well-dressed dinner tables. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, shoulders still straight out of habit, chin set in a way that made strangers stand a little taller when they passed me in the grocery store. But at home, all that remained was the slow hollowing out of purpose. Retirement was meant to be a reward, a time to rest and pass on wisdom. But for me, it had been a gradual exile, as if my identity was a uniform hung in a closet, only to be remembered for funerals or the rare community parade. I stopped telling stories. I stopped offering advice. My voice became another quiet sound in the house, something to be tuned out with the news or drowned by the television. When I brought out old photographs, grainy images of distant deserts, camaraderie frozen in black and white, faces of men who never came home, the boys would glance at them and nod politely, eager to move on to the next conversation. I learned to let those moments pass. I learned that silence was easier than seeing their discomfort. The cruelest thing about being erased isn't just the loneliness, it's watching those you love act, as if your absence is a relief. The few friends who remained from my service years would sometimes call, their voices hesitant, wondering if I'd heard from the boys lately, if I was keeping busy. They knew, though, without needing to ask. We all shared that particular brand of solitude, the kind reserved for those whose greatest years were spent in places their families would never visit, for causes the world soon forgot. I would lie awake at night, sometimes, listening to the ticking of an old clock in the hallway, counting out the seconds in which my legacy seemed to grow fainter. And yet, through all of it, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to the memory of what I had been, the weight of command, the gravity of responsibility, and the moments brief but real when I had felt indispensable. It was a truth they could not take from me, even if they refused to see it. So I kept my past folded away, hidden but never surrendered, waiting for the day someone might need to remember it, not for their comfort, but for my own. It's strange how a uniform can hold the shape of a man long after the world around him forgets what he once was. After my son's message and the long drift through rooms steeped in the silence of erasure, I found myself standing in front of the old wardrobe at the end of the hallway. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that lets old thoughts settle on your shoulders like a familiar coat. My hands hesitated on the brass handles for a moment, reluctant, almost as if opening that door might pull too many memories into the light. But I opened it anyway. The hinges creaked, dust swirling in the sunlight that cut through the slats in the blinds. Inside, my uniform hung untouched. The dark wool still looked sharp against the faded lining, the gold braid on the cuffs and shoulders gleaming softly, 5 silver stars catching the light. There was a stillness in the fabric, a kind of dignity that did not fade with the year's medals arranged in neat rows. Campaign ribbons aligned with military precision, a legacy sewn into every thread. I ran my fingers along the collar, remembering the weight of it on my shoulders. The nights I'd buttoned it in silence before facing rooms filled with uncertainty. The mornings I'd stood before young men and women who looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear, trusting that I could lead them through whatever storm waited outside. Here, in this room, the uniform was just cloth and metal, but when I wore it, it was the armor that held me together. I thought of the last time I'd put it on, years ago, for the funeral of an old friend. My sons had stood at a distance that day, watching but not truly seeing me, whispering among themselves as if the past was just an awkward shadow. After that, I folded the uniform away, believing there would never be a reason to wear it again. Life after the military had become a study in gradual invisibility, each day blending into the next trips to the grocery store, silent meals, the ritual of watering plants and sorting through mail no one really sent. Even the old medals, once heavy with meaning, seemed to shrink in the darkness of the wardrobe. I had stopped polishing them. I had stopped hoping anyone would ask what they meant. But as I stood there now, tracing the rows of campaign ribbons with a hand that still remembered how to salute, a slow defiance stirred inside me. The world could shrink my place at the table. My sons could edit me out of their stories. But this uniform remained. It was proof that I had been more than an afterthought. It was history, not for the display, but for survival. In its fabric lived the weight of orders given and followed, sacrifices made, nights lost, and friendships sealed in hardship. I was not just a relic in this house. There was a part of me that still fit the uniform, still knew what it meant to stand straight when everything else wanted to fold. For a long moment, I simply held it, feeling the gravity of all it represented. And then I made the decision silent, certain, and absolute that I would not let this piece of my life be buried along with my pride. It's a particular kind of ache, the decision to show up where you are not wanted. It's not bravery, not exactly. It's a quieter thing, a refusal to disappear, a way of standing up in your own life, even when every sign tells you to sit back down. As I held the uniform in my hands, the room seemed to contract around me, walls leaning in, the ticking clock in the hallway louder than it had ever been. I let my thumb run over the ridged edge of the Medal of Valor, felt the roughness of campaign ribbons, and tried to remember the man I had been when I'd first earned them. There was pride, yes, but mostly there was duty, a sense that you showed up, even when you were exhausted or unwanted, that you carried your burdens in silence so others could rest easy. That's what the uniform meant, even now. The phone with my son's message lay face down on the table. The words still burned behind my eyes. Don't show up today. A failed old man just makes things awkward. I thought about how easy it would be to obey. I could disappear, let them have their picture-perfect celebration, remain a shadow at the edge of the family story. No one would stop me. In some ways, I'd already been practicing that vanishing act for years. But standing there, the uniform heavy in my arms, a stubborn heat flared in my chest, a feeling I hadn't recognized in a long time. I remembered younger days, the countless times I'd walked into impossible rooms where no one wanted to hear what I had to say, and spoken anyway. I remembered nights on foreign soil, when the only thing that kept men alive was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had not given up on them. Maybe it was just pride. Maybe it was something closer to hope. I laid the uniform on the bed, every movement deliberate. I pressed the jacket, polished the buttons until they gleamed, straightened each ribbon until it sat at perfect attention. With every gesture, I felt the years of silence begin to fall away, not entirely, but enough to remind me that dignity, once earned, does not need permission to be worn. My reflection in the mirror was older than the man I remembered. The lines at the corners of my eyes cut deeper by disappointment, but the set of my jaw was unchanged. I knew, as I buttoned the coat and aligned my medals, that I was not going to fade away for their comfort. I took out the old ceremonial shoes, brushed away the dust, and set them by the door. It was almost ritualistic, the preparation, the kind of routine that steadied nerves and reminded you of purpose. There was no audience, no encouragement, only the quiet click of buckles and the soft thud of metals as I fastened them in place. Still, I felt a kind of steadiness return, the ghost of a man who had never once hesitated to step forward when the moment called. I packed away the phone, the invitations, the bitterness. None of it belonged to this decision. If my sons wanted to erase me, let them try, but I would not make it easy for them. When everything was ready, I stood for a moment in the hallway, breathing in the familiar smell of old wood and polish. My hand hovered over the framed photos that lined the wall, weddings, graduations, moments from which I had been quietly cropped out. This time, I would not let myself be invisible. Alone, without fanfare, I opened the door and stepped outside, my uniform fitting not just my body, but the quiet resolve I carried with me. I was going to that event, not for them, but for the truth of who I was and had always been. There is a peculiar hush that precedes the kind of entrance no one expects, a hush that trembles just beneath the hum of casual conversation and the clink of glasses, waiting for something or someone to rupture the surface. I arrived at the venue alone, the weight of the uniform grounding me as I crossed the parking lot. My shoes, once black as midnight, tapped out a measured cadence against the pavement. Each step rehearsed in decades of parades, funerals, and long walks into rooms where respect was never a guarantee. I could feel the eyes of strangers as I approached the entrance, curious, uncertain, perhaps even a little nervous, as though some half-remembered instinct told them to stand a little straighter in the presence of a man bearing 5 stars on his shoulder. Inside, the air was warm with the familiar trappings of family celebration. Laughter floated above the din, punctuated by the sharp staccato of cutlery and the low thrum of polite music. Children darted between tables, their voices clear and oblivious to the undercurrents that wound through the adults. I paused in the foyer, the soft light catching on the gold braid at my cuffs, and took in the room where I had not been wanted, not even as a guest. I could see my sons across the sea of faces, shoulders drawn tight, laughter forced. There were glances in my direction, first uncertain, then sharp with recognition, but no one moved to greet me. If anything, a ripple of discomfort spread outward as guests took in the unexpected sight. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the world turn as it always had, indifferent to the battles a man must fight, simply to be seen. But this time, I did not shrink from the moment. I adjusted my jacket, feeling the weight settle against my frame, and walked further in, eyes level, back straight, a posture honed from years of standing before men and women who waited for orders or for comfort, sometimes for both. Conversation faltered as I passed, voices trailing off mid-sentence. I caught a handful of murmurs. "Is that him? That's their father, isn't it?" And saw a handful of guests, faces unfamiliar but respectful, instinctively sit a little taller, as if called to order by the echo of some half-remembered drill. I did not seek out my sons, nor did I look for a seat. I simply took my place along the wall, content to observe the lives that had moved on without me. The laughter resumed, but thinner now, as if everyone was waiting for a cue that had yet to arrive. I felt no triumph, only a strange kind of sadness for how small their world had become, a world where a father's pride must be hidden to make space for convenience, where silence was the only inheritance left. Yet as I stood there, dignified and silent, I knew that for this brief moment I could not be ignored. The uniform, the medals, the very history stitched into every seam of my coat refused to be erased. And though no one said a word, the atmosphere in the room had shifted, and I knew it was only the beginning. There's a look a man never forgets, the precise instant when pride collides with shame and the world tilts beneath the weight of everything unsaid. My sons wore that look the moment they spotted me, framed by the entryway in full dress, stars and ribbons catching the light that fell in heavy stripes through the hall's arched windows. For a heartbeat, I could see in their faces the boys I'd once carried on my shoulders, the boys who used to beg for stories of distant places, who would run to the window at the sound of a passing parade, hoping to catch a glimpse of their father among the marching lines. But those days were gone, smoothed over by years of resentment, small betrayals, and the silent bargain of mutual forgetting. I saw the way my eldest's mouth fell open, not in greeting, but in disbelief, his glass of champagne pausing mid-air as if frozen by some unseen hand. The younger gripped the back of his chair, knuckles white, eyes darting between me and his friends, scanning their faces for cues, for ridicule, for anything that might help him make sense of the scene. In that moment, I was not their father. I was a problem that had crashed their carefully curated celebration, an unwanted headline printed in the flesh. The message they had sent me, those words meant to banish me from their story, hung in the air between us, as heavy as any reprimand I'd ever given in the field. Around them, the room struggled to decide which script to follow. Some guests stared openly, curiosity sharpened by the whiff of scandal. Others avoided my gaze entirely, eyes dropping to their plates or flicking to the nearest exit as if proximity to embarrassment was contagious. My ex-wife, seated at a table near the front, regarded me with the brittle composure of someone used to rewriting history at dinner parties, a smile stretched too tight, a posture stiffened by years of rehearsed indifference. Even the hired photographer seemed unsure, his camera lingering at his chest, finger hesitating on the shutter, as if to capture this moment might be to admit it actually happened. I made no move to approach them, nor did I offer any apology for my presence. Instead, I remained by the wall, a silent challenge to their attempt at erasure, the living proof of a past that refused to die quietly. The uniform was not a costume, not a cry for attention, but the sum of everything I'd carried: sacrifice, duty, leadership, now weaponized by the simple act of being seen. My sons whispered together, heads close, their words lost in the low drone of background music and the anxious glances of guests who pretended not to notice. I could almost hear their arguments. How dare he show up? Why would he do this? Doesn't he understand? They looked everywhere but at me, their discomfort radiating outward until even the conversation at neighboring tables dulled to a polite hush. If they had hoped I would slink away, they were mistaken. There was no room for retreat in me. Not now, not after so many years of silence. My presence was an answer to every dismissal, every time they'd seated me near the kitchen, every phone call that ended with a promise to visit soon that never came. I let the moment stretch, let them taste what it felt like to be the center of attention for the wrong reasons. I wondered if, in their hearts, they remembered even for a second the man who had once been their hero. But if they did, it was quickly buried beneath the urgent, adult need to reclaim control, to push the narrative back toward comfort and forgetting. What they failed to see, standing there in shock, was that this time the story was no longer theirs alone to write. There is a power in silence that no insult can ever hope to match. After the shock of my arrival and the stunned faces of my sons, the room fell into that uneasy quiet where every second stretches thin and brittle. I remained by the wall, my posture unwavering, letting the discomfort settle. My sons, pale and paralyzed, avoided my eyes, and my ex-wife fumbled with her napkin as if it might shield her from the truth blooming across the tables. No one seemed able to bridge the gulf that had opened between my presence and their carefully edited reality. But the silence was not empty, it was waiting. Across the room, a man I'd never met before began to rise. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the kind that spoke of years lived by protocol rather than impulse. He wore a civilian suit, yet there was a precision in his bearing that any career soldier would recognize instantly. He moved from his chair with the ease of someone accustomed to standing for something greater than himself. Conversation, already faltering, now died away completely. Guests looked up, some in curiosity, others in sudden, inexplicable anticipation. Even my sons, who had been whispering frantically to each other, fell silent, their attention dragged to the man as if by the pull of gravity. He approached me not with uncertainty, but with the respect of someone who knows exactly what he's seeing. He stopped just before me, his eyes meeting mine, a look that carried questions, recognition, and a quiet, almost reverent admiration. Without a word, he squared his shoulders and brought his hand to his brow in a crisp, formal salute. The motion was flawless, not the lazy half-gesture of civilian life, but the precise, unmistakable respect given only from one soldier to another, and in this case, from a subordinate to a superior of the highest order. For a heartbeat, everything else fell away, the tension, the resentment, even the years of being sidelined by those who called me family. The room watched, transfixed, as the salute cut through decades of disregard and redefined the narrative in a single, soundless moment. In his eyes, I saw a silent acknowledgement of battles fought and burdens carried. In his salute, the validation of a lifetime. My chest tightened with a strange blend of gratitude and sorrow, for this recognition came not from my own blood, but from a stranger who saw in me what my family could not or would not see. The impact was immediate. A hush swept over the guests, and I could hear the faintest murmurs. "He's a major general? Did you see the stars?" That's real authority. Respect, the kind I had not tasted in years, drifted from table to table, subtly reshaping the air. My sons remained motionless, their sense of control dissolving, their attempt at erasure openly, irreparably undone by a single act of honor from a man who owed them nothing. The stranger held the salute for a moment longer, then dropped his hand with the disciplined snap of someone who had never forgotten the old ways. I nodded in return, acknowledging not just his gesture, but the brotherhood that exists far beyond the boundaries of family, age, or circumstance. In that instant, the center of the room shifted. The uniform, which my family hoped would embarrass or isolate me, became the axis on which all respect in that hall now turned. Even as my sons floundered in their silence and the older relatives struggled to mask their discomfort, I stood taller, steadier, knowing I had brought into that gathering something they could neither erase nor ignore. History witnessed and a dignity reclaimed, all in the solemn rising of a single unknown man. As the stranger's salute faded into the air, it was as if the entire room exhaled at once, though no one dared speak above a whisper. I felt not pride in the boastful sense, but a sober relief that someone at least had honored the journey that those 5 stars represented. Now, all eyes had turned in my direction. It was no longer possible for my sons to pass off my presence as an awkward accident, nor for my family to tuck me back into the margins of their story. A subtle shift swept across the guests. Posture straightened, faces softened, and the conversations that tried to rise fell away like the last notes of a funeral hymn. I became, in that moment, not a source of embarrassment, but the unspoken center of gravity for the entire gathering. The whispers began first soft and almost reverent, moving table to table like a ripple over still water. Is he really a major general? That's what the salute meant. Look at his uniform. Did you see the ribbons? He's a real hero. People who had known me only as a name in family stories, always footnoted, always cast as the distant or difficult relative, were now confronted with a reality they could not ignore. I watched the recognition dawn on faces young and old. A few of the elders, veterans themselves perhaps, exchanged knowing glances, and I saw a quiet nod of respect pass between them, a wordless acknowledgement that went deeper than any toast or speech could hope to reach. A cluster of my son's friends, men and women in tailored suits and careful smiles, began to piece together what they were witnessing. Some tried to hide their curiosity. Others leaned in, suddenly eager to be closer to a history that only moments before had been treated as a burden. My ex-wife's mask of composure fractured as she realized that her attempts to rewrite the family narrative had failed, at least for this afternoon. Even the event's host, who moments ago had barely acknowledged my existence, now approached with an unsteady smile and a handful of polite words. "It's an honor, sir." "I had no idea." Her voice trailing off as she realized the inadequacy of any small talk in the face of decades of silent service. My sons were caught between worlds, the memory of their message to me, "Don't show up, you old failure," now an unbearable echo against the growing tide of respect in the room. I saw in their eyes a tangle of regret and humiliation, not just for what they'd written, but for years spent believing that dignity could be discarded when it became inconvenient. There was no anger in me, only a patient sorrow. I did not come here for revenge, nor to bask in vindication. I stood quietly, letting others fill the silence with their own revelations. The guests began to shift, some rising discreetly to approach. A few shook my hand, offering subdued but genuine thanks for my service. A young girl, perhaps a grandchild of one of my relatives, stared at the medals on my chest with wide-eyed wonder, asking softly, "Did you really do all those things?" I nodded and smiled as gently as I could, remembering how rarely children are allowed to see quiet courage up close. There was no applause. None was needed. The atmosphere was heavier, somehow sacred, charged with a humility that only truth, long hidden and finally revealed, can summon. For the first time in years, I felt the burden of invisibility ease, not gone, not forgotten, but made bearable by the simple fact of being seen, truly seen, by those who had never thought to look beyond the label of failure. The uniform no longer felt like armor, but a testament unspoken, undeniable to a life lived in service, no matter who tried to erase it. And as the recognition spread, I realized the story of that day would echo far beyond these walls, lingering in the hearts and memories of all who witnessed it, impossible to rewrite or ignore. In the aftermath of the recognition, a hush settled over my family more profound than any argument, more final than any insult. The guests' attention had shifted. What began as a celebration under the shallow current of old wounds was now irrevocably changed. Respect had replaced discomfort, and what lingered now was the uncomfortable truth that nothing could return to the way it had been before. My sons, who once commanded the center of these gatherings with ease, now sat stiff and uncertain, their eyes glued to their hands, unable to muster the careless bravado that had always shielded them from consequence. The message they had sent me, a few cruel words meant to keep the past buried, now felt like a stone in their throats, impossible to swallow or spit out. My ex-wife, for years the quiet architect of my erasure, shrank further into herself, her posture rigid, fingers twisting her wedding band out of old habit. For so long she had told the story of our family her way, painting me as an inconvenient relic, someone best remembered with faded photographs and brief, sanitized anecdotes. Now, with one salute and a ripple of public respect, that narrative cracked open for all to see. She did not approach me, nor did she meet my eyes. I knew that the silence between us would never be filled with apologies. It would remain, a void carved out by choices that could not be undone. The rest of my relatives seemed just as unsettled, shuffling awkwardly through small talk that could not mask their discomfort. A few attempted strained justifications, whispered at the corners of the room. We didn't know he'd come like that. Or no one told us he was still serving, but the words fell flat, drowned out by the memory of the salute and the dignified way I'd carried myself. Some reached for kindness in retrospect, offering hesitant nods or clumsy, belated invitations for coffee or conversation. But even those gestures could not erase the years of absence, the empty chairs at family tables, or the holidays spent pretending my existence was a distant complication. My sons, trapped in the gravity of their own making, seemed to search for a way back to the simplicity of before. I saw it in the way they looked to each other, desperate for some private signal, some excuse to break the spell and return the day to its former script. But no words came, not the old jokes, not even anger or defiance. There was only a thick silence, the kind that stings more than shouting, each second drawing out the memory of what they'd done and what had been lost in the pursuit of comfort. For the first time, they looked small to me, not as children, but as men who had never learned the difference between pride and dignity, between erasing the past and owning its lessons. Around us, the celebration continued, but its meaning had shifted. The laughter was softer, the music a mere backdrop to the reckoning that had unfolded at the heart of the room. Some guests, still speaking in low tones, cast sympathetic glances in my direction. Others seemed eager to move on, anxious to forget the discomfort that truth had brought into the open. Yet nothing could truly erase what had happened. The story of this day would grow in the telling passed along in family circles, whispered at future gatherings, retold not as the event where the old man embarrassed himself, but as the day the family was forced, for once, to confront what respect and history actually meant. And still, I did not move. I stood as I had always stood, quiet, patient, unwilling to fight for affection that was never freely given. My dignity was intact, unassailable, drawn not from the approval of my blood, but from the long, hard years of sacrifice that could not be reduced to a punchline or erased with a text message. The silence of my family was, in its own way, the loudest confession they could make. They could not find the words to offer forgiveness or seek it, and so they remained still, the shame and regret hanging heavy in the air, a quiet coda to a story they had never imagined would be told. There are moments when a man knows the weight of every year, every sacrifice, every choice that led him to the present. Standing in the center of that hall, with all eyes upon me, I felt the shape of my entire life pressing in from all sides, regret and resilience, sorrow and hard-earned pride. For a long moment, I simply let the silence linger, not as an accusation, but as a memorial to all that had been lost between these walls. When I finally stepped forward, the room fell utterly still, the orchestra pausing mid-note, the laughter and whispers dying like embers in the wind. The hush was neither fearful nor expectant. It was the collective awareness that something true was about to be spoken. I did not raise my voice. I spoke as I would have in a war room or at the edge of a distant field, quiet and certain, the authority in my words flowing not from rank, but from survival. Some of you know me only as a name in stories. Others, perhaps, have tried to forget me altogether. For years, I have worn the uniform of a major general, but here I have been allowed only the uniform of absence, of memory, of the silence you keep for the uncomfortable truths in a family's history. I was told I should not appear here, that I would bring only shame. But I have carried shame, and I have carried honor, and I can tell you this one is a wound, but the other is a scar you wear with your head held high. I glanced at my sons, at my ex-wife, at the relatives whose faces blurred at the edges of my memory. I did not come to embarrass you. I came because the truth matters more than comfort, and dignity matters more than approval. All of us, at one time or another, must choose whether to remember the past honestly or to bury it beneath convenience. I chose not to disappear. I chose not to let my life's work, and the men and women I served beside, be reduced to a forgotten footnote. I came so that, at least once, you would see me as I am, not as you wished I would remain. The words were not a weapon. They were an offering. I did not expect forgiveness, nor did I seek apology. Instead, I spoke for the sake of all those who had been silenced, for every father and mother pushed to the shadows when their stories became too inconvenient for the world to hear. Respect, I said softly, is not given by invitation, nor is it inherited. It is earned, and it endures. No one can erase what is true, nor rewrite a legacy carved in sacrifice and quiet courage. And I hope sincerely that one day you remember not the uniform, not even this moment, but the simple truth that history matters because it is lived, not hidden. I saw for the first time my sons looking back at me not with resentment or bravado, but with something deeper, perhaps confusion, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. The guests were silent. My ex-wife's eyes glistened, though she tried to blink away whatever feelings the moment had forced to the surface. No one spoke. I did not ask for applause. I offered a final nod, not as a general, but as a man who had learned what dignity costs and why it matters. With slow steps, I made my way toward the exit, the 5 stars still shining at my shoulder, the silence parting before me like a path. I did not look back. The hall would fill again with voices and music, the memory of discomfort fading for some, but I knew the shape of what I had left behind. In a single afternoon, the story had changed not just for me, but for every man and woman in that room who had ever wondered if silence was the only legacy they would leave. My presence had become the testimony, my dignity the final word. And as I stepped into the evening light, I carried nothing but the certainty that history, once spoken aloud, can never be made invisible again.